My book, Scansion in Psychoanalysis Art, is about just that. It's about the concept of scansion and how it is applied in psychoanalysis, in psychoanalytic practice specifically, and in the creative arts. Scansion is a concept developed by Jacques Lacan. He developed this in order to engage the person's unconscious more when they're in an analytic session. Now, the idea behind that is if someone is used to the accustomed 50-minute session, for example, then sometimes people will use that in a defensive manner and not really get to the underlying things they need to get to in that session to have the best experience and use of the time. So Jacques Lacan decided to start cutting the sessions at points in the analysis that he found were especially potent or powerful, so that the analysand, the person in analysis with him, could leave at a moment that was an aha kind of moment where their mind was open to new ideas and possibilities rather than just at the end of a certain amount of time. Now, a lot of people don't agree with cutting the session because that means you might only meet with the analyst for 5 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and people are generally accustomed to 50-minute sessions. I personally don't cut the session in that way, but I found that you can punctuate people's speech during the session in a similar way that can still provide that accent on that experience, but still within the analytic hour. For example, you can just repeat a word back to someone in an inquisitive tone or something like that that just marks it for them so that they take a look at it and say, what did I mean by that word? Things like that. While I was studying Lacan very intensely while I was living in New York, I also began working with the cut-up method, and I started realizing that the cut in artistic practice and this cut in psychoanalytic practice had a lot of similarities. So I started looking at that and playing with that and practicing that myself through the cut-up method as developed by Brian Geisen and William Burroughs, also looking at the accidental poems of Tristan Tzara, collage, montage, photo montage, assemblage, different ways of working in the arts that also use the cut in some way. And I found a lot of similarities because while the Surrealists are usually the artistic movement that's most associated with psychoanalysis, really I felt like the Dada and this method of cutting up and disassembling things and rearranging things was more akin to the psychoanalytic work and the unconscious.
Could you give me some examples of artists that you mention in the book and also how they have applied the cut?
There are many artists that I go through in this study. We start at the beginning with photography and how that really changed society by providing a cut in the way that people view themselves. And people now really have a hard time understanding what it could have been like before the advent of photography, because basically our whole world is built around that now. The image, photos, digital media, social media, none of this could happen, movies, television, without the photograph first. So that was a real point in history where perspective really changed. So we begin with that, and specifically looking at photographers like Ouija, who worked in New York, Henri Cartier-Bresson, and many others. And Edward Muybridge, of course, who was instrumental in showing people's movements cut up in time, which people also hadn't seen before, and the movements of horses galloping and athletes running and that sort of thing. And it really helped people to see things in a new way. And of course, Freud was inundated with this kind of photography when he was developing psychoanalysis, because the medical field was inundated with it for the first time like they'd never been before. Also, there were postcards of people traveling, all sorts of things. Photography really took a hold of society, and this influenced Freud's thinking. People even at the time of Freud described photographs as little mirrors of memory. So we look at that as well. And then we move on from photography and look at how photography started changing art as well. So not only did it change medicine, anthropology, and general social sciences, policing, forensics, all sorts of things, It also changed the way artists looked at themselves in the world, because artists, instead of simply painting the world around them like they had before, painting portraits, photography started taking over those arenas. So the artists started painting more expressively, and we end up with expressionism, impressionism, symbolism, and the modern art movements that took over around the turn of the previous century. We look at people like Henri Matisse, for example, and Gauguin, and many others, including literary artists as well. Then from there, we look at the unfolding of this change of perspective. We could also talk about Egon Schiele, Gustav Klimt, and these artists that also started not only looking at their internal worlds and painting them or expressing them through their art, but they also started gathering together more independently and creating their own art groups and art shows and art festivals, which also hadn't been done before, because being able to do things themselves was new. And before this, even with photography, before this, people were really only able to see what authority figures had decided they could see, like through the news and media. And having a portable camera, for example, put this possibility into the hands of the common person, which hadn't happened before. So instead of just seeing what the news media, which could be, of course, propagandic, would show you, instead you could start deciding for yourself what you wanted to take pictures of, what images you wanted to see. And that was also a huge shift of perspective of that time. And artists started gathering together more independently and throwing their own shows. And from there, I start looking at this effect in music as well. Around the same time, in the early 1900s, noise music began with Luigi Russolo and his noise organs. He had the technical skills to be able to fix watches and musical instruments, and he began to develop organs that reflected sounds of the cityscape, of the industry that was popping up since the Industrial Revolution. And of course, also then World War I came into effect. And those kinds of sounds, the sounds of war and the city and industry, were all reflected in the music that he would make. And again, as I've talked about recently in a lecture I gave on this, people can't really understand how different this was now, because now we've been able to do this for more than 100 years. But at the time, these artists, this music, these concerts, they caused riots. People who saw them or heard them really flipped out. They caused riots, and they were rioting in the streets, and they found it to be incomprehensible that people could be creating sounds like this instead of something that was harmonious. And that's something that the Dadas, who we talk about in the next chapter, talked about. They said that art, until that moment in time in history, had served civilization, to keep civilization intact. And as the First World War was happening, they felt their art was going to reflect destruction of civilization through war, and they called their art anti-art. And the Dadas, of course, started with the Cabaret Voltaire, with Emmy Hennings and Hugo Ball in 1916 in Zurich. A lot of artists gathered in Switzerland at that time because Switzerland was neutral during the war, so people fled there for safety. And you had artists from all over the world, all over Europe and North America, gathering in Switzerland, and they formed this kind of loose movement called the Dada movement, where they had dance and singing, of course, but also literary movements. Tristan Tzara from Romania made his cut-up poems, his accidental poems, live on stage in front of an audience, where he would cut words out of a newspaper, put them in a hat, and pull the words out one by one to create poems. And that, of course, is very reflective of the cut-up poetry that came later with Brian Gysin and William Burroughs, that developed out of the Beat Hotel in Paris in the 1950s. And of course, that's very influential on my work as well. And so then from the Dada movement, of course, once that World War ended, everybody spread back out and moved around, and Tristan Tzara went to Paris, where he joined with Francis Picabia, and they continued the Dada movement there, which then kind of turned into the Surrealist movement. Duchamp, Max Ernst, a lot of different artists gathered at that time in New York and Paris mainly, but also all over Germany and other places around Europe. And from there, they created Dada journals and the first basically zines, and they started producing them themselves. So I talk about that. And then also the development of collage and photo montage, which again had never been heard of before. And just like people weren't sure that photography could be a real quote unquote art form in the beginning, people did not like people cutting things out of magazines and pasting them together and calling it art at first. And there was a big backlash against collage and montage as well. And of course, in that chapter, I talk about John Hartfield, for example, and Hannah Hook and their work. And then from there, I specifically have an entire chapter dedicated to Marcel Duchamp, because his change of thinking about art and the way of interacting with the audience has been so essential in developing basically the entire contemporary art world that we have today. So we talk about him and his kind of play with the audience and positioning of the viewer with the artwork that he did intentionally before he, of course, left the art world. And after that, I dedicate a chapter to the Surrealists, and this is where Lacan comes in. Lacan kind of grew up. He was born in 1901, and he grew up during the Dada and Surrealist movement of Paris in the 20s and 30s, and it was very influential on his thinking, and you can see I think that's why he's such a creative thinker in the field of psychoanalysis, because he was inundated with Dada and Surrealist thought. And he did weave, literally, Surrealist thought that he would read, like from Salvador Dali, into his doctoral thesis, for example. He didn't tell his professors he was reading the Surrealists and integrating them into his psychiatric ideas and theories, but he was. And that's one of the things I really want to change, because it's a shame that a doctor doesn't feel like he can talk about his influences being that of artists, but we absolutely should be able to, especially within the field of psychoanalysis, where it is such a creative form of practice. And then from the Surrealists, of course, we talk about Dali, Max Ernst, Breton, a lot of the main Surrealists, and then also Pierre Molyneux, who was a little bit less well known, but is becoming more well known now in his play with the double, with identity and gender. I also talk about Hans Bellmer and his work with Unica Zern and their dolls and their binding of Unica's form. And I also talk about Ovar Tachi, who's a Danish outsider artist who's known well in this region, but also not as widely. And she created fantastic fantasy worlds full of hybrid creatures, just like Max Ernst and Leonora Carrington did, and different fairy worlds, worlds of sprites and animals, and even extraterrestrial beings. And she kind of created her entire habitat and had her entire world that she lived in, the room that she lived in. She was interned in a psychiatric ward, covered with these wonderful dolls and figures that she would create from paper mache. So we talk about Ovar Tachi in that way. And then as the book continues, we go into film from there, and experimental film, and how film has also developed with psychoanalysis since the turn of the previous century, and how there's always been experimental cinema alongside mainstream cinema. They've both developed together. And we talk about Maya Deren, Jonas Mikas, Hans Richter, and a lot of other fabulous experimental pioneers of cinema. Kenneth Anger, of course, as well is mentioned. And then more contemporary artists like Derek Jarman and Vicki Bennett of People Like Us. I also talk about the film Me and My Brother, which was the first film that looked at the issues within the American mental health care system, which of course are still prevalent today. It's by Robert Frank, came out in 1968, and starred Allen Ginsberg, Peter Orlovsky, and his brother Julius. So definitely fantastic film. A lot of people don't know about it, and I'm really happy to highlight that film as well. And then from the Beats and their involvement in experimental cinema, we look more at their work, of course, and the Beat Hotel and the cut-up method and how it expanded over time in William Burroughs and Brian Geison's practices and spread out from there, and of course was a big influence on my own work and the work of many others, including my lovely husband Carl Abrahamson, Genesis P-Orridge, and a lot of other people we know and talk about all the time. And then I also talk about Andy Warhol, who of course also did experimental cinema at that time. Taylor Mead was someone who was involved with him, and I used Taylor as sort of a bridge between experimental films from the Beat time to Andy Warhol's era. And Andy Warhol taught us to look at not only the object that the artist creates, but at the artists themselves, and showed us that the artists themselves and their lifestyle and their whole life as a creative art was really what should be focused on. And of course our world today is so focused on that almost most people are more interested in the lives of artists rather than actually the artwork they produce at this time. Andy Warhol, of course, had his factory, and I talk about other artistic communities that were around at that time and in eras that happened from then on, including the Exploding Gallery and performance art collectives like Coombe Transmissions, and leading on into the Temple of Psychic Youth and Crass from the 1980s. I also talk about other performance art collectives and the time period in the 70s, late 60s, when performance art really started taking to the streets and art began leaving the gallery. We talk about the Viennese actionists and others that worked in this way. So of course, we go into the work of Genesis P-Orridge and Jen's later work with Lady J, where they formed Briar P-Orridge and their Pandrogyny project. So I talk a lot about that and looking at Lacan's mirror stage and Freud's idea that our ego is first formed from our body as a body ego, and that Jen and Jay's work really reflects that. And then the final part of the book focuses on people that work with morbidity, technology, and death and the unexpected, like artists like Francis Bacon, Joel Peter Witkin, Charlotte Rogers, who creates wonderful assemblages of things that she finds in her world as she walks around through her day. As an analyst, I definitely see psychoanalysis as a creative process, and it's not just a science as it tried to be. And that's why I think it's not so prevalent in medical establishments at this time. Mostly the people interested now in psychoanalysis are people in the arts and humanities, artists, creatives, philosophers, people in film and film studies. That's where psychoanalysis really resides. That's where psychoanalysis really resides now. And I find that creative people understand the process of psychoanalysis and love especially this way of working with Scansion, where we try to break down narratives that we've internalized rather than the kind of idea of an old classical psychoanalysis where a person is talking and then the analyst kind of tells them, oh, well, you feel like this because your mother did this and your father did this and you want this. That's not the way that psychoanalysis is happening so much nowadays. Now it's much more focused on trying to understand these internal monologues that we have and where these ideas about ourselves have come from. And we start to realize that these ideas we have about ourselves come from society, come from our parents, and they're ideas about ourselves that we've internalized and begun to identify with and believe them so strongly that we hold on to them even to our own detriment. But if we can locate those ideas and start to question them and take a look at them, we can decide, do I really want to continue my life believing this about myself, believing this about society, based on my class, my gender, my identity? and then we can look at them and we begin to have more possibility about where we go from here in our lives, and begin to make choices about how we want to act and react to the world around us, rather than just being caught up in automatic reactions and actions that we've been kind of conditioned to be in as a result of the way we were brought up.
Tell me a little bit about your work with the Rendering Unconscious podcast.
I've been doing Rendering Unconscious podcast since January of 2018, and it's been a wonderful bridge from my life in New York to my life here in Sweden. I began the podcast actually when I was in the process of moving from New York to Sweden. While I was in New York, I was involved with a group called Das Unbehagen with several other colleagues, and for 5 or so years we were putting on almost weekly events, talking to various psychoanalysts and people that understand and use psychoanalysis in their work, whether they be philosophers or other members of the humanities or artists and so on. And I basically continued that work that I had done with Das Unbehagen in New York into my current life through the podcast and through inviting creative thinkers. Anyone who's interested in psychoanalysis is welcome on my podcast to talk from all sorts of different perspectives and worldviews. And I also like to focus on people with different worldviews that may not be necessarily people that are involved in psychoanalysis or philosophy, but people that have creative ways of thinking and looking at the world. Because as psychoanalysts, we're not just focused on theory, we're very much focused on clinical practice and praxis and what psychoanalysis looks like on the ground, in the clinic. And you have to have an open mind to people from all different worldviews and something to learn from all of these worldviews. And I feel like the narrow view that's taught in academia is really, really just that, very narrow, and is focused mostly on philosophy at this point and its relation to psychoanalysis. And that's great for what it is, but in the clinic you really need to open your perspective, not narrow your perspective. So it's important to listen to people from all different walks of life, from all different creative pursuits, and to open your worldview to possibilities and potentialities of the human condition.
What is the best thing about working as a psychoanalyst on an international level?
One of the best things about working as a psychoanalyst on an international level is that I get to do exactly this. I get to talk to and hear from people from all over the world, people who have moved to different places all over the world, come from different places all over the world, and are having completely different experiences from one another, and also help them through the transition to, say, a new place if they have moved to another country, just like I have. There's a lot of particular experiences that come along with that, adjusting to new culture, adjusting to a new language potentially, adjusting to a new way of working in that place. And that's why I started my group that meets every Tuesday. It's specifically for people who have moved to another country, and we meet on Tuesdays at 6 o'clock here in Sweden, which is 12 o'clock noon in New York, and 9 a.m. on the west coast of the US, 5 p.m. in the UK, and 7 p.m. in Beirut. And we meet and we talk about these things and feelings of alienation and isolation, and also all the new things that you learn when you move to another country, and how you see your own culture that you came from in a new way. Really, so much opens up in so many different ways, and we explore of that together. So I love having the group and talking with everyone there, and also working with individuals who live everywhere from Vancouver all the way to Ho Chi Minh.
What can people in general and artists specifically learn from your book?
I wrote my book Scansion In Psychoanalysis Art mostly for artists who love the artists in here. It traces a certain streak of the avant-garde from the dawn of photography all the way to current time. And if people like these kinds of artists in this book, then I hope they'll pick it up and learn a bit of psychoanalytic theory along the way, and how you can look at your mind in different ways based on it. We talk about dreams, we talk about using the cut, looking at identity, and all sorts of things. Sexuality, of course, gender. And For analysts, I hope they enjoy the book as well. It's written in a way that is accessible to everyone, so I didn't write it specifically for other psychoanalysts. I wrote it in a way that takes complex ideas and explains them in a way using regular common language, not jargon words typical in psychoanalysis, because I want anyone and everyone who enjoys this work to be able to read it and get a lot out of it. And I hope for the analysts that read it, of course, it'll help them to see how you can explain these ideas and concepts that are very complex in simpler terms in order to invite more discussion with other people and other fields. But also maybe they'll learn about some avant-garde artists that maybe they hadn't heard of before, because I found in psychoanalytic conferences often the same artists are talked about over and over again. James Joyce, for example, Samuel Beckett, and a lot of times they're people that were referenced by Lacan. So I think that we can do better and talk about other artists and other thinkers besides the ones that Lacan referenced.
You're an award-winning psychoanalytic podcaster and a very sought-after author and editor of psychoanalytic books. Do you feel that work complements your clinical work in a creative way?
Yes, I absolutely love doing writing and editing alongside the clinical work. I learn a lot from the clinical work itself. That's where I've always understood psychoanalytic theory, and we always have to remember that that's where the theory came from in the first place. It came from Freud in his clinic and working with his analyses, and Lacan's work came to him the same way, and merging his clinical work and what he saw in the clinic with his knowledge of philosophy and the humanities. And that's how he developed his theory. So I work in much the same way, where I learn most from my analyses and my work with them, and I've seen how people kind of have tendencies to work through similar patterns over their life, and when they're trying to get out of specific relationship cycles, for example, or patterns or habits that they're trying to break or change, and how that change actually comes about on the ground rather than how we wish it would happen in our idealized world, and helping people have compassion for themselves while they're undergoing these processes, which are a lot of work and do take time to adjust. So using my knowledge from my extensive clinical experience, I've been doing this for over 20 years now, and then mixing that with the writing and my creative art work really has helped me see all of these theories in a new light and apply them in different ways, both theoretically and in praxis.